United States Department of Agriculture.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. I think a few more people will start coming in as I'm giving my intro, so we can start the recording. So thanks everyone for joining our sixth webinar in the Transdisciplinary Approaches webinar series. My name is Jessica Shade. I'm a national program leader at USDA NIFA. I'm one of the organizers of the Transdisciplinary Approaches webinar series, although the credit for putting this webinar together goes to Allison Meadow at the University of Arizona, who I'll be handing the mic over to in a bit. We always include our non-discrimination statement in our decks because there's zero tolerance for discrimination in these events. This slide has the contact information if you'd like to make a complaint. And for those of you who haven't joined us before, this webinar series focuses on both the opportunities and challenges that come with using transdisciplinary approaches. So we dive into some of the more in-depth topics and nuances, exploring what makes these approaches so powerful. And when we talk about transdisciplinary approaches, we're not just thinking about crossing academic disciplines. We also mean bringing in stakeholders and having them as critical members of the team. So the webinars in this series look at how this collaborative process can help tackle complex challenges in meaningful ways. I encourage you to check out some of our previous webinars, which you can watch at this link on the National Ag Library website. We also have another webinar in the series planned for the week of March 24th. We're still hammering down the exact date and time, but it's going to focus on transdisciplinary approaches used by our international partners. So we'll hear from projects going on in Austria, Switzerland, South Africa, and more. We'll send everyone an email once that registration page goes live. So something to look forward to in 2025. And please stick around after the presentation because we're going to have an evaluation poll where you can help us improve our webinars for the future, help identify topic areas that you'd be interested in seeing us focus on. So stick around. The poll only takes like a minute or two to fill out. All right, so today we have a webinar that I personally have been really looking forward to because it tackles an area of transdisciplinary approaches that we don't always but should think about at the onset of a project. So how do we evaluate these types of programs? We're going to hear from program leaders who have a lot of experience working with transdisciplinary and engaged research to hear about what they've learned and how to encourage the inclusion of transdisciplinary approaches in projects, how they review and evaluate projects, and what tools they use to measure the outcomes and impacts. If you think of questions as you're hearing from our speakers, feel free to enter them into the Q&A tab. We'll have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. We're going to try to get through as many as we can. We always have more questions than we have time for, but please put your questions in because we will have about a half hour for Q&A. So Allison, I will go ahead and pass it over to you to do introductions.
Thank you, Jessica. And I'm going to, oh, okay. We're going to leave this screen up and I'll go from here. Sorry, I was trying to share my screen and got confused. Well, thank you, Jessica, and thank you to Pamela and the whole crew organizing the webinar series. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm really excited about today's panel. It's certainly a topic that we've been talking a lot about over the last year and a half or so that the webinar series has been going on. So let me introduce our panelists. First, Aparna Bobside-Dodson is the Assistant Regional Administrator for the U.S. Geological Survey's North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, or NCCASC. She undertakes stakeholder and partner engagement to identify strategic science goals, outputs, and objectives. Dr. Bonsai Dodson has a BS in statistics and mathematics from Virginia Tech, a master's in environmental management from Duke University, and a PhD in geography and environmental sustainability from the University of Oklahoma, where she focused on the theory and practice of engaging stakeholders in the creation of actionable science for climate adaptation. Dr. Bonsai Dodson's research provides the North Central CASC with opportunities to learn how to improve its practice of producing usable knowledge to support decision-making. Our second panelist is Megan Brass, who is a collaborative research manager, or is the collaborative research manager at the University of Michigan Water Center, where she serves as a program manager, engaging multidisciplinary, multi-sector teams to develop and implement user-driven collaborative science projects. For the past 10 years, she's been helping to lead NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve, or NERS, Science Collaborative, which is managed by the Water Center and supports research designed to address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. She oversees the day-to-day administration of the program, coordinates regular requests for proposals, works closely with collaborative science teams, and contributes to social science research that answers critical questions for both the practice and the field of collaborative science. Charlotte Hudson directs the Lenfest Ocean Program within Pew Charitable Trusts, a grant-making program that identifies, supports, and communicates marine science concerning threats facing the world's oceans. She is responsible for identifying thematic areas of research and overseeing the design and implementation of research projects that meet the program's criteria. She also oversees the communication and dissemination of research results in ways that inform policy decisions and promote the sustainable management of oceans. Before joining Pew, Hudson was the senior marine scientist at Oceana, an international marine conservation organization dedicated to protecting and restoring the world's oceans. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Davidson College and a master's in environmental management from Duke University's Nicholas School for the Environment. And our fourth panelist, Molly Hunter, serves as the science advisor to the Joint Fire Science Program, a national interagency program dedicated to funding research related to wildland fire. Molly also supports incident management teams responding to wildfire events as a public information officer and has extensive experience responding to media requests during wildfire seasons. Prior to joining the federal workforce, Molly held faculty positions at the University of Arizona and Northern Arizona University, where she developed and taught numerous undergraduate, graduate, and continuing courses and maintained an active research program in fire ecology and management. Molly has conducted research and written on many topics related to wildland fire, including fuel treatment effectiveness, fuel treatment economics, invasive species, prescribed fire, and fire science application. She has a PhD in forest science from Colorado State University and a Bachelor of Science in plant biology from the University of California at Davis. And after these amazing introductions, what I'm struck by is what an incredible panel of people doing, really focusing on the work of how do we make sure that our climate and environment work is focused on transdisciplinary research, engaging our partners in this, and really coming up with on-the-ground tangible solutions. And I cannot think of four better people to share their experience doing this work with us today. So, but before we get to them, I'm gonna take just a couple of minutes to provide a little bit of extra background before we launch into our panel discussion and have the experience and wisdom of our panelists come forward. So, Jessica, if I can switch with you, and I'll share my screen. Great. So Jessica already gave us sort of the big background on why we wanted to do this panel, reviewing and evaluating transdisciplinary and engaged research projects. We had heard over the last about 18 months several questions after each one of our webinars about sort of the logistics and the mechanics of how transdisciplinary approaches work within a research funding agency. How do we figure out what's good? How do we know when they work? So, we've got challenges with funding teams that incorporate lots of different organizations and institutions and people. And how do you figure out what the outcomes of transdisciplinary research is when you need to look at the research process, you need to look at those standard science or academic outputs, and you need to figure out those on the ground, real, tangible impacts, which is why we pulled this panel together. As you just saw in the introductions, we've got representatives from 4 different research agencies and organizations, all focused in the climate and environment space, but each one has their own specific area of interest. And as we talk through with all of them, you'll see that each program and each person is using slightly different terminology, slightly different language, but really share the same common goal of engaging with partners, with societal partners in a problem-solving manner to really figure out how do we get to real change in the world through our research. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to all of these questions, which is why it's so helpful to hear from a number of different organizations. And with that in mind, I'm just going to do, just so that we all sort of start off with some shared terminology. We don't have to all use the same language, but it's really helpful for us to just know what the other one is talking about. So I'm going to go through just a really brief background on some of the terms and ideas that we've been talking about in this webinar series. So, okay. One way to think about all of these things is with this big umbrella term, engaged research, which is really an approach to research in which our non-academic partners and their lived experience, expertise, and knowledges are meaningfully involved as equal participants in the research process. The goal of this mode of research is to generate useful solutions, useful research, and solutions to problems that are generally too complex for any one discipline to solve. I like to think when we think about all of the related research traditions and terms that we share DNA across all of these. Almost like think about cousins. Everybody has a slightly different approach and a slightly different focus, but we really share this commitment to engaging with our non-academic partners and experts and finding real tangible solutions. So some of the terms that you may have heard: community-based participatory research, co-production of knowledge, collaborative science, actionable knowledge, convergent science, knowledge exchange. Obviously, today we're talking about transdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary approaches. Some others that we often think of in this space, sometimes we can think of citizen science or translational research if we do those in a mode that is two-way and we're really sharing knowledge back and forth. So there are a lot out there. These are just a few of the most common terms I could think of. Sorry, I need to get my little screen moving here. All right, couple of definitions again, so that we're just on the same page here. Transdisciplinary approaches, as we said, seek to integrate multiple types of knowledge and actors in the research partnership. The methods are action-oriented, and we're looking at wicked problems, basically problems that are complex and where the challenges are uncertain, where we may have competing values, and where honestly we don't know exactly what that finish line looks like, and we need to all work together to move towards it. USDA has defined, NIFA has defined their transdisciplinary approaches this way, that they intentionally integrate knowledge from different disciplines with relevant stakeholders and community members to address societal challenges. I really like this last sentence. The development of transdisciplinary approaches engages these diverse teams from the onset of project conceptualization. So we're bringing our partners in right from the beginning. I think that these little images are a great way to think about and understand the different modes of research. I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. First, we've got disciplinary research, where we each have our knowledge area and each discipline sort of has a problem that they're working towards, those little white circles. Every discipline has a set of questions and they're moving towards those. When we get multidisciplinary research, we might have a common theme. Those are the problems that we're working towards, might have something in common. We might be seeing some talking back and forth across those disciplines, but we're sort of all still trying to solve our own problem. When we get to interdisciplinary research, we see that all of our little black disciplinary dots start talking to each other, and we're all aiming towards one common problem or one common question. And then transdisciplinary is we're bringing in that external, non-academic, on the ground, practical expertise and knowledge into these discussions. And then we've got that all of those knowledges talking to each other, and we're all working towards a common goal. I want to stress all of these modes of research can yield incredibly beneficial and useful information. It's just that when we focus on that transdisciplinary research, we know that we're working towards a complex societal problem and making sure that we're bringing in all of those necessary forms of knowledge. Why does this work? A couple of basic reasons. First, we're involving the people who know the issues. We need a really big perspective on these complex issues. We need everybody's knowledge there at the table because we can't possibly understand it all on our own. So we need our scientific experts. We need the practice-based experts. We need people with lived experience of whatever the problem that we're looking at. Depending on the research that we're doing, Indigenous knowledge holders can be part of an integral part of this deep knowledge of places and systems. Transdisciplinary approaches involve the people who can enact the change. We as researchers are rarely the ones who are actually going to change the policy or practice. In fact, sometimes we really draw a line and we say we're not the ones that are doing that at all. So we have to have the people who can enact the changes to make the impact in the world. So that might be producers, resource managers, policymakers, community members who are the ones who are going to change things on the ground. It makes the research salient and accessible. We are making sure that we're addressing the questions that are the priorities of people on the ground, of the decision makers, and it makes sure that the research is there for them, easy to access and use. And it builds trust. First, we're taking science out of the black box. We're saying it all in. We need everybody's knowledge. We need everybody's expertise. We're going to show and be really transparent about how we do this work. And that demystifies and it takes it out of the black box and it really builds trust. We're also just basically demonstrating our respect for other people and other people's experience. And that is also a trust building aspect. And one of the things that we know when we do this work is people don't use the science if they don't trust the science and don't trust the people conveying the science. So this is a really important element of transdisciplinary work. All right. With that quick overview, I am going to turn it over first to Aparna. We're going to go through, all of our panelists are going to just give us a little bit of background about the program that they have been working in and the kind of work that they're doing, and why their program views transdisciplinary engaged research as really core to the kinds of work that they want to fund. So Aparna, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Allison and Jessica and USDA for this invitation to be on the panel and the wonderful overview before this. So as Allison mentioned, I'm Aparna Bomzai Dodson. I work for a region, the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And next slide. And that is part of a network of 9 regional adaptation science centers. So as you can see, we cover the continental US, Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories of the United States of America. And we are a partnership between the US Geological Survey and universities and non-government organizations across the US. So the idea is to do very place-based work on this regional scale. And then we're overseen by a national climate adaptation science center. So we have a headquarters office that governs the activities of all of these 9 regions. The enterprise is actually fairly young for the federal context. We've only been around for about 15 years. So we've had a lot of opportunity to learn from what other programs have been doing and try to innovate from there. Next slide. And our mission is to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. So very much focused on natural and cultural resource management. As a result, we have some primary partner communities with which we work. So our other Department of the Interior bureaus, such as the National Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies, primarily Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Game agencies, and Indigenous communities, because the Department of Interior also includes the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so what we're trying to do is really create scientific information, products, and tools that are directly useful and usable by these partners to make resource management decisions. Next slide. And the language that we use for talking about this, as Allison said, we all use slightly different terminology. The term that we've landed on is actionable science. So this is, as I mentioned, science results that lead directly to meeting constituent needs. We try very hard to make sure that these are policy relevant scientific results. They're not prescriptive. They directly address needs. They're accessible, understandable, and available so that they are then actually useful and usable. Next slide. And something that we acknowledge is that in order to do this, we don't just need to fund research, we need to fund support activities in addition to that research. So we expect that our projects also have components of communication, partnerships, and capacity building. And these are all important components of then having science that gets used by partners, not just science that is useful and usable. And so next slide. I'm just going to stop there, and I will talk a little bit more, I think, in the panel Q&A about how exactly we do this. But I did want to put a slide up there with our website. We're on Instagram and X as well as a program in case you would like to follow us. And you can email that email address if you would like to be added. We do have an e-newsletter that lets people know about the funding opportunities as they come out and other positions that are available with our network. And now I will turn it over, I think, to Megan.
Yep. Moving to Megan. Thank you, Aparna.
Thanks, Allison and Aparna. I'm already excited to see some similarities even in the little bit that you already shared, Aparna, with your program and the one that I work with. So an important starting point to understand kind of what I'll be speaking to is understanding the context within which I work. And what you see here is my context. The program we serve is the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. This is a national network of 30 unique research reserves. As shown on this map, each of those blue states has at least one reserve. And this includes Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. And the reserve system is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner. And so that's NOAA and either working in partnership with either a state agency, a university, or a nonprofit. The Neuroscience Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for this reserve system. And we fund and support research that's designed to address coastal management needs that have been identified by the reserves. And so for the last 10 years, the Science Collaborative has been managed by the Water Center at the University of Michigan, and that's where I sit. And this is through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. And during our tenure of managing the program, we've supported more than 150 collaborative science projects. We go to the next slide. Just wanted to share a little bit about kind of what we're all about. This is our vision statement at the top, which is all about coastal and estuarine health and resilience, and that being supported through better coastal policy making and management decisions that are informed by the collaborative science of the reserve system and their partners. We have kind of four main objectives here to deliver that mission over the years. The first is focused on delivering the best national collaborative science program possible. And this includes our competitive grants and a lot of effort and energy put into supporting project teams. Our program officers work really closely with them. We run workshops to tackle topics that they've identified that are helpful to work through these collaborative science projects. And we do a lot of learning alongside them. Our second objective is focused on supporting the diffusion of knowledge that's developed in the projects that we support. And this is diffusion of knowledge across the reserve system and with its partners. We do this through some of our grants. We actually have one style of grant that's really great at doing this, and also through communication efforts. Our third objective, this is one of those common themes I was noting, is about increasing the capacity within the reserve system to do collaborative science. So we support peer learning. We do a lot of translating of what we're learning into tools and resources for teams and applicants. And this is a lot of this is available in our online resource called it's our Guide to Collaborative Science. The fourth objective is focused on increasing capacity of project teams and the reserves to identify and communicate the outcomes of their work. And this is an area we've been investing a lot more energy in over the last few years and exploring some alternative approaches there that I could speak to later in the conversation. And last, but I think just as important as all of these individual objectives is really, across and within all of them, there are lots of feedback loops happening, a lot of adaptation cycles. We're a learning program and frequently making adjustments to make sure this program is meeting the needs of the system. Next slide. I just quickly wanted to share kind of the common denominator across all of the projects we fund is that they're all collaborative science. That's the term we use. This really user-driven, explicitly designed to meet the needs of intended users style of work. And it's our belief that using this user-driven collaborative process, that the projects we support will generate good and more inclusive science that is ultimately more relevant, useful, and impactful. And the last slide here, I just wanted to offer a quick summary of the two types of competitive grants we offer. They've come about and been refined over the last decade and really reflect kind of this deep conversation we have with our user community, the reserve system, to give them the grant opportunities that meet their needs. So we have our kind of research style grants, the larger, longer grants that are generating new science to inform decision making, and our Catalyst Knowledge Exchange, which are a completely different flavor, our smaller to mid-sized grants that are really about advancing collaborative science and knowledge. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And we are going to shift to Charlotte.
And thank you so much, Allison and Megan and Aparna. I was quite literally taking notes during your presentation. So I think what this we will all probably share widely here is, because there is no one size fits all, we all are still learning from each other, and happy to be here to learn from all of you who are listening at the same time, because I, for one, will say that we are a little bit building as we go. So with that being said, my name is Charlotte Hudson. I direct a program called the Lenfest Ocean Program, which is based at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And you can go to the next slide, Allison. And we are a little bit different from the first two speakers in that we are a private philanthropy. So we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we run our grant making calls for proposals. We can either do open calls or we can do invitations only. And that has certainly been part of our evolution, how we think through the way we are thinking about our and what we call it is useful and usable science. So we call it useful use-inspired science, and kind of sit in the middle of that science policy interface. A lot of people ask, why do you have a different name? It is because a very smart gentleman, way ahead of his time, Jerry Lenfest, who ran the Lenfest Foundation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, seeded this program at the Pew Charitable Trust back in 2004, and we owe him a great debt for doing so. Next slide. So the challenge, though, that Jerry Lenfest gave to Pew was that he wanted Pew to establish a program to spend money on marine science. And I feel like this will help, explaining this, I think will help understand a little bit of the evolution of how we came to think about the way we do grant making. And so Jerry said, great, I'm going to give you this money, but I want you to give out grants on marine and coastal science. But then in your grant reports, I want you to tell me what change it's made in the water. And I said, what? I'm good on the science grant making, but I've, there is a long tangential line between having the right information and then healthy oceans, right? And so there were two main challenges I felt I first had to face. The first was, why do people care? Why would people care about using science in decision making? As we know, it's not always the first thing. Most of the time, it's not the first thing that is discussed in a decision making context. The second challenge I had, which is on the next slide, is that the science we were funding was actually helpful. Is it what the communities need? Do they have a reason to use the information that was being presented? And so this really led us, and this gets to the next slide, this really led us to evolve. And this was not overnight. This was really a 20-year evolution through a program of much trial and error, which was, how do we design projects? And this was back when we were only doing invitations. So we had a much greater flexibility to put project teams together, to encourage project teams, particularly on the research side, to operate a little bit differently than they had normally. So traditionally, scientists would send us a bunch of great information that they know what's needed next to help, inform their community or sustainable oceans. And we found through trial and error that information wasn't always as useful as it could be. And so we evolved our approach. And so, as you'll see kind of on the far left here, we now flip science on its head for many people, which is the research questions that we think should be prioritized are not just coming from the research teams alone. They are coming from collaborative efforts across industry and all other stakeholders that are involved, whether it's communities, natural resource users, beachgoers, however you would think of all the individuals who use and enjoy ocean and coastal spaces. And we then required these collaborative research projects as part of our grant making process. And because 20 years ago, this was not as common, and it's not at all common today, but 20 years ago, it was even less common. So we actually wrote guidelines for our grantees and posted them online and said, here is what we are going to expect if you get a LenFest grant. This is kind of the types of projects we're looking for. Here are the guidance questions we're presenting to you, because this is how you're going to be evaluated. So these things should fall into your proposal. We should be able to see these things in your proposal. As such, of course, information sharing throughout the project's life cycle has been critical. And we do believe that there has been increased information flow, to increased useful information to communities because of this process. Next slide. But the problem is, I can't quite take my word for it, right? And there was a box here on this slide that used to say, how do we know if we're being useful? And I think that's the evaluative piece here, which is, we think we are being useful by engaging in these transdisciplinary, useful and usable driven science projects. But there's an evaluative piece here that is ongoing. And that is a part that I think we will all talk about is evolving as we go, but is also making great strides in recent years, I would say. And I think the next slide might even have some of that. Yes, so we as a program, for lack of to be able to measure ourselves internally, created our own categories of impact of how do we think about evaluating our research projects. But these useful and usable research projects require different metrics than traditional science projects. It's not just citation counts and in your H score. And so we created categories that we thought more aptly described what we were trying to achieve in these projects. And so the categories of impact, and they're it's fine, really are more about the dialogue and the conversations that happen when the research is being undertaken, as well as how informed are the decision makers and communities as part of this project. And so I did throw in, Allison did a preview of my last slide. Because we work on ocean and marine and coastal spaces, I am allowed to throw in the cute picture at the end. So I've looked forward to this conversation.
I said to Charlotte yesterday, it's really not fair because the rest of us can't put adorable ocean creatures on our slides. But thank you so much, Charlotte. And Molly, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And thanks for the invitation. This is really, really great panel. I'm learning a lot already. So a little background on the program I work for, the Joint Fire Science Program. This was established in 1998 as a partnership between the the Department of Interior and the USDA Forest Service, so two agencies that work heavily in wildland fire. Jointly funded program, although we're housed within the Bureau of Land Management. And our mission is to provide funding for research and science delivery and science exchange specifically to that's associated with managing wildland fire fuels and fire impacted ecosystems. So our audience, if you will, are people who work in that space in wildland fire management. So that could be federal land managers, state land managers, but also private land managers who are working in wildland fire, and people who are working to protect municipalities and people who live in the wildland urban interface from fire, things of that nature. So that's who we're targeting when we're looking at our science and science exchange. Next slide. So some key elements of our program that help us to meet that mission. We take pride in really listening very carefully and intently and often to the needs of managers and practitioners and policymakers who are working in that space to make sure that we're asking questions in our funding calls that are relevant to them. So framing the actual question is a big part of our work, of my work. We don't typically have very open funding calls. We have very specific research questions and gaps that we're asking people to address based on the needs that we're hearing from the field. So with that, we develop an open solicitation process, have a robust peer review process where we look at the technical merit of the proposals, but we also look at what they're proposing for the exchange of science, both at the end of the project and throughout the project. So those are both evaluated. And then we put a lot of energy and investment into sharing, synthesizing, and interpreting the results of the research and making sure that those results are getting into the hands of people that are going to use it. And then as a program, we also incorporate regular evaluation, both as a whole at the entire programmatic level. We do periodic reviews. And then also for elements that we support, we also do frequent evaluation and reviews to make sure we're meeting our mission. Next slide. Wildfire is by nature very interdisciplinary. So, you need to understand physical sciences to understand how fire is going to behave and how the smoke is going to behave, ecological sciences to understand, what are the effects going to be on ecosystems and how to mitigate that, and the social sciences to understand the impacts to communities. Even medical science, to understand what the implications of working in wildland fire are on firefighter physical and mental health. So our program touches on all of those elements. It is very interdisciplinary. These are just some examples of topics that we've addressed in our funding call recently, but it kind of spans multiple disciplines across wildland fire. Next slide. We're governed by a 12-member governing board that represents both the USDA Forest Service and several bureaus under the Department of Interior. They represent both research experience and practitioner experience too, and that's written in our operating guidelines that we have that mix of expertise in our board. And then we are managed by a small group of there's 4 of us here, but it's actually 5 people now housed within the BLM. And also within our program office, I'd say we span disciplines. Some of us have more expertise in science, some of us are more expertise in management. Next slide. One thing I'll talk about throughout this webinar, it's a big part of our program, is the Fire Science Exchange Network. It's a network of boundary organizations that we stood up over 10 years ago. And their mission is to work across the science manager interface within wildland fire in these defined regions. And they've been it came out of several program reviews where folks were saying to us, you're funding great science, but not enough of it is getting to the ground. So in response to that, we stood up this organization network to really accelerate the adoption of science in wildland fire. Next slide. And this is the objectives of that network. So they are designed to share information and build relationships. So make sure that scientists and managers and practitioners and policymakers are convening and talking to each other and getting to know each other, just establishing those relationships. Highlighting science and translating science that's applicable to their region and demonstrating it on the ground. Also identifying new research needs and synthesis needs and data needs. And we rely heavily on them to feed that information back to us so that we incorporate that again into our funding opportunities. So again, making sure that we're addressing questions that are directly relevant to the people on the ground. And then supporting adaptive management. Next slide. Just some examples of some of the products the exchanges engage with or have produced. They do newsletters, blog posts, syntheses, host webinars, workshops, field trips, very, very productive group. Next slide. And then I'll end just with a couple examples so you can have a better sense for what I'm talking about. This one topic had to do with utilizing prescribed fire in southeastern pine systems where there's been big buildups of duff in the soil over several years with fire exclusion. And then how do you then, reintroduce prescribed fire into those systems without killing mature trees? So we funded some science that ultimately led to some guidelines for how to do that. The Southern Fire Exchange, one of the members of our Fire Science Exchange Network, then took that science and incorporated it into workshops and field days and fact sheets and things of that nature, and helped get that practice implemented on the ground. And they're able to come back to us and say, yes, that is more common practice now, the guidelines that were developed as a result of that research. So having that boundary organization in place is really key for us, I think, for accelerating the adoption of science. Next slide. And then one more quick example. We've also funded some research around firefighter safety zones and escape routes. So these are looking at, what characteristics are needed, how big do they need to be, things of that nature in order to keep firefighters safe. That research was incorporated into story maps and videos, fact sheets by our Southwest Fire Science Consortium, another member of our network. And that then has been incorporated into annual trainings that all firefighters have to take in order to keep their qualifications, so that they have that mental image of, what's a robust safety zone look like, and what do I need to be thinking about? Next slide. Yeah, and like everyone else, we have a website. We're on various social media platforms, and I can put some of this into the chat to make sure that's accessible to everyone, but there's lots of areas to get further information.
Thank you all so much. What a great, again, even more information than and ideas than I was thinking. Not surprised. So let's have more of a conversation now. We've got a few questions that I think come from some of the conversations we've been hearing from previous panel discussions and things that I kind of know are just relevant in this field. So Aparna, I'm going to ask you to kick it off and take my first question, which is to tell us a little bit about how you've crafted solicitations or calls for proposals so that you're really clear to applicants that your expectations are around engagement and producing that actionable science that's so important in the CASC network.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Allison, because that's actually something that we have tried to do a lot of work on over the last 15 years. When our program started, we took a lot of lessons from other climate funding programs in the government. And so we were asking for our science priorities out there. We ended up getting a lot of projects, initially project proposals that were focused on understanding how the physical climate system is going to change and how that would impact fish, wildlife, and their habitats. We weren't getting a lot of proposals for adaptation science or for how management would then be affected by the science. And so what we ended up shifting our language to do initially, we shifted from thinking about purely scientific priorities that were focused on products to using the language of co-production, which is trying to produce science with researchers and partners together. And we realized that that's a process, for engagement. And maybe that wasn't actually our goal. Our goal wasn't necessarily for these scientists and researchers to always be working together. Our goal was for something to be done, for some action to be improved. And that's how we came to actionability. Actionability is an outcome. It's not a product. It's not a process. It's something that has happened as a result of what was funded. And so that's the language change that we've had over the last 15 years. And it's noticeably improved the fit of what we're receiving with the goals of the program. The other thing that we've done is rethought how we evaluate statements of interest and proposals. So our program does take a portfolio approach to funding projects. We don't only look at raw scores from reviews. We also consider, do we want to fund a suite of projects on something, or do we need to think about the geographic complementarity of what we're funding? But we do collect external reviews on our projects. And there are two review criteria in particular I wanted to call out. One criteria is the applicability of the science to a high priority topic for climate-informed natural or cultural heritage resource management. And so we're asking reviewers to specifically think about, does this apply to something that resource managers care about? And then the other criteria is the actionability of science and products through appropriate coordination with partners and end user engagement. So is the science applicable and important? And then is the science actionable? Can it be used? For statements of interest, those two criteria make up 2/3 of the score. For full proposals, it makes up 50%. So it's a large percentage of your score that is being determined just by those two criteria alone. Leaving out, your scientific rigor, the quality of your science, just on those two criteria. And then another thing that we just started doing this year in our region, we try to be very careful about only inviting full proposals with a good percentage of them then being funded. So we expect that if we're going to invite you for a full proposal, you have at least a 50% shot of being funded. It's a lot of work to make these kinds of proposals, to build the relationships, to get buy-in from your partners. And so it doesn't make sense to make the percentage really small. This year, we then, for those people we invited to provide a full proposal, offered some one-on-one coaching during that full proposal development stage. And we offered to have phone calls with them to go through reviewer feedback and help them decide what they should really think about addressing and what maybe wasn't quite as important, making some trade-offs there, and then helping them understand what we look for in a fundable project. So helping them understand, for us, actionable science, but transdisciplinarity, how do they articulate those ideas in a way that will resonate in the proposal? So trying to add some support structure for the PIs, and then also recognizing that we're asking a lot of our PIs with these requirements. And so are there ways that we can try to take some of the pain away for them?
Thank you. So that's a really comprehensive, you're looking at the whole, the whole lifespan of proposal development. Just keeping a little bit of an eye on the time, and I have lots and lots of questions. So I want to jump and we're keeping this open to everybody, but I'm going to prompt Molly first to talk a little bit about sort of that next step. Aparna got us to being very, very clear about the criteria for applicants and providing reviewers with some of that information about what the expectations are. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about how Joint Fire Science approaches kind of the logistics of review, who you're getting on your review panel, how you're thinking about who is taking a look at these proposals. And then Charlotte and Megan also jump in.
Yeah, so we've always made it a point in making sure that we have diverse perspectives on our review panels, because we're asking people to look at the scientific merit, of course, but we're also asking people to look at, you know, the science exchange and the relevance of the proposals to a problem that we're identifying. So we always try to have both scientists and practitioners serve on our peer review panels. We try to include people that, you know, kind of span their, or, you know, a wide span of people in terms of their level of experience in their profession. So we've had graduate students serve on our panels, and, you know, all the way till senior members in their profession. So having that diversity is really important. And I think that that carries throughout our whole program. I mentioned our governing board has diverse perspectives. Our program office has diverse perspectives. And we all make a point of, you know, staying engaged, even though we're mostly working in science, staying kind of engaged in the practitioner community as well by, you know, taking fire assignments and things like that. So we're, you know, trying to be very cognizant of that in all aspects of our program.
Megan or Charlotte, do you have any more ideas, maybe something different or something that's really similar about how you're approaching that, making sure that what comes in the door is really relevant and really what you're looking for?
Yeah, I was going to add on top of what Molly shared, we have a similar approach where our panelists are really this balanced set of, you know, estuarine science and collaboration experts, you know, scientists, program leaders, practitioners who are participating in our review processes. And we actually try to recruit returning panelists from year to year, aiming for a half to 2/3 returning, because there's so much learning on the review side. So that can be really valuable from our perspective to ensure that we're reviewing these proposals well. And we also do a lot of prep with our panelists. We have some prep calls, and we have some resources we share with them to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're evaluating, what is most important to the program, and ensuring we're having a consistent approach.
The only thing I would add to that is, as the Lenfest Ocean program moved more from an invited proposals model, where we worked directly one-on-one to prepare proposals alongside the grantees and all the partners. When we moved more to the open call request for proposal model, we started, whenever we would have an open call, we would host a series of webinars that were a little, you know, that frankly most closely mimicked office hours, where we would give a, you know, 10-15 minute, here's what we're looking for from the science side, from the chat, this is the challenge we hope to help inform, and at the same time, a little of the nuts and bolts, walking through, here's what we mean by useful and usable science, here's what we expect in terms of partnerships, and here's how we think about the evaluation of these proposals. And I will say, at least from the evaluation side, in a similar way, I would say the useful and usable science has the most weight of any piece, but it's actually built into almost every question we ask. So, you know, in the research questions section, the strength of the research, one of the sub questions under the research is, where did this idea come from? You know, did this come from the community, or did this come from an R1 research institution, right? You know, how did this question, or why the issue that they want to investigate, where did it bubble up from? And so then you have, of course, also the sections of evaluating the usability of the science. You know, who's involved, how long have they been involved, at what level, how many meetings, how many meetings have you had with them? Now, again, all of this can come out in paragraph form. It's not a number counting game, but it really is a feeling you get from the narrative in these proposals of how engaged the research community and the partners are in the project's development. And I will say one thing we haven't mentioned yet, but I think is probably one of the most critical, is the budget. We really look to the budget at the end of the day to say, have they built in these engagement meetings? Are they traveling? Are the research teams spending time in community? Are they spending time in the places that they're studying? How is that engagement happening? And if the research team says, oh, yes, we're talking to everybody consistently, and there's no money to actually go to place, then that's a real red flag, right? So, and I think similarly, and this has come up as an evolution of what we've done, is we also reimburse stakeholders for their participation. That is, I think, a critical piece. And again, because we are operating as a nonprofit or private philanthropy, we are able to put in or ask for proposals that include an equal amount of appropriate amount of compensation for the stakeholder engagement in those communities and research partners as for the research team themselves.
Charlotte, you've perfectly anticipated. And Megan, I'm gonna bump this question over to you, but you perfectly anticipated the next question, which was, how have your programs had to rethink your budget model, how you're funding the projects? But I think all of you have also touched on how you have to rethink about the resource expenditures on your programmatic side, because you're all providing a lot of capacity building for your applicants as well. So Megan, maybe you can jump in on how the Neuroscience Collaborative has been thinking about both that. What are you looking for in the proposals, and how have you maybe needed to change your funding model for projects, and then any programmatic changes?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Charlotte shared, and excited to like just jump in with, oh, our example of it is this. And yeah, I think something that's been really fundamentally important in the proposals is to understand the process underway, right? The process of where the idea for the project came from, and hearing how intended users and partners have helped shape the project and are involved throughout. Asking for those letters of support that demonstrate that, asking for the explanation of how you're going to be working together, because process really matters. You can articulate some goals for some outcomes, but reviewers really need to understand how you're going to go about doing that. And that's the time you committed to it, the resources you've committed to it, and the explanation of how you anticipate coming together. And I, thinking about our programs, our research opportunities over the years, they've evolved quite a bit. And I can share a couple of examples, I think, related to some of what Charlotte was sharing about things we've done to kind of emphasize the things that are critically important from our perspective. And as we watch reviewers work through this process of understanding what applicants are proposing. Fairly early on in our program, we established the requirement for applicants to identify a collaborative lead in all of our projects. This is someone who's responsible for the full engagement of intended users, and they're helping to develop and manage the process. They're not doing it alone, but they're helping to give careful attention and thought to that. And so this came from feedback from the people with whom we work, right, who have been applying for these projects, and explaining that this role was critical for all the work that's being requested of us, all the things that are being requested of applicants, but frequently overlooked and under-resourced, undervalued. And so us as the funder making it a required role was really paramount to, I think, elevating it to this kind of other standard role in research grants, like the technical lead, and ensuring that there was a dedication of resources to that important role. Similar to what Charlotte said, we have been trying to be more and more intentional about resources, confirming that those resources are dedicated for the collaborative engagement steps, and even helping applicants see where there is, flexibility in use of those funds, adding specific language, even in the evaluation criteria, as reviewers are prompted to consider the budget. Does it include those resources that are necessary to support equitable and meaningful participation of partners? That's travel support, honoraria, compensation for childcare to attend a meeting, provision of traditional foods or gifts that have cultural significance when convening partners. So things like that applicants think, I don't know if I can dedicate resources for, are part of the program, and making that clear to them. And I think one other important takeaway, I think, for our program is I showed just 2 competitive grant opportunities. Over the years, we've had many, and getting feedback from those we're working with. We have our research opportunity, which is the huge investment, the huge effort to run the project when you're ready. But recognizing that collaborative science, there's a lot of pre-work to set up an idea, imagine the idea with your partners, build those relationships, those connections and trust. And then there's sometimes post-work as you're thinking about, okay, we just finished the work and how do we take it to the next level for use and things like that. So designing opportunities that cover all of those areas of, moments in the process has been really valuable and appreciated, I think, by those that we're working with.
Give Aparna or Molly a chance to jump in on the how you're thinking about budgets and funding.
Well, I'd say one thing that's a little bit different about this is we significantly changed our investment strategy over 10 years ago by standing up this regional network of boundary organizations. And we've committed to it for the long term. Now they're, as I said, they're almost 15 years old. And it's a significant portion of our budget, 35%, sometimes more, of our investment strategy. And I think when we were just starting out, it was a little bit, oh my gosh, that means like how much of that is not going to go towards research, but I think we've all recognized how much that has paid dividends, because they are working over that whole time frame to build relationships, to provide that support for translating the science and convening people. And I think what we find now when we put out a funding call, we have a pretty sizable population of scientists that are accustomed to working with practitioners and already have that built-in relationship. So as a program, we don't have to kind of lay all that groundwork. We've got this great organization that is working over years now to do some of that groundwork for us.
The only thing that I would add, the others have all given wonderful perspectives on funding from the program perspective. I would just say that on an individual project basis, there's often also a need for flexibility with how funds are spent and what objectives end up being completed, how tasks are done. We've had a number of projects where the partnership with the external partner, the manager, is fairly new. And so you end up with a proposal where you have some great ideas. And as you start the work and you have more conversations, you realize, oh, they need something different. Or this thing that they asked for is going to take all the time in the project. And this other thing we thought we could do, we're not going to be able to do. And our program is very willing to work with our project investigators. They come to us and kind of explain, this is a situation we're in. Can we change our deliverables? Can we change our commitments? Can we redo our scope of work? And so that's something that we have tried to maintain a lot of agility around, openness to working with the scientists on that, just because the most important thing is the partner uses the product at the end. And if the PI does science the way it's written in the proposal and it's not what the partner wants, that's not really meeting the goals of our program. So it's a little bit of the flexibility around our funding as a program, but also trying to enable the scientists to have flexibility in how they spend the project funds.
Great. Well, wanting to leave a little time for there's great questions from participants, but I have because several of them are about the last question that I wanted to ask anyway. And Aparna, you just got to this. Like, ultimately, what you're looking for is like, did it work? Did you produce something that somebody can use? And so I wonder if each of you can talk a little bit about some of the metrics that you're looking for. And maybe they're not metrics. They don't have to be those numbers. But like, how do you know whether a project has worked and has achieved those goals? What's your evaluation rubric? And then your program more broadly. How do you know you guys are on track? So Charlotte, you shared a little bit of that in your introduction. I don't know if you want to give us a couple of quick examples.
Sure, I'm happy to go first to share whether I think my project is on track. That's the question of the hour. I think whenever you are in a grant giving situation, whether it's in a public or private situation, I think you do carry a lot of weight that, where you are, the funds that reviewers or the process you're facilitating is sending money in the right direction that does help societal goals in whatever community, in whatever topical area you're working in. And so I think most of us have ingrained this need to, even at any level, kind of seek feedback on how these projects are being used. And so that's what led us to develop really our own kind of guidance and metrics around how we evaluate projects. And I think it starts with two things. One, when we have, when we initiate a project, when funding goes out the door, we have what we call kind of a project development or a project scoping meeting with our team that outlines why the project was funded and, frankly, who we think they're going to engage with and what we expect to happen. Or, for example, who we expect to be informed. We, just like everyone else in this call, are not looking for outcomes in terms of what change needs to happen in one direction or another, or policy change or regulatory change. It's more, was the information used? And so who are the people who are making those decisions, and are they engaged in the project? And who do we expect to be engaged in that project? And so we've kind of put a marker in the sand, so to speak, of what we think this project is hoping to achieve as it moves forward and moves throughout the process through research results. Just like Aparna, though, there's a lot of flexibility that comes into that where, frankly, entire landscapes or policy landscapes can change, regulatory landscapes can change in the middle of a 3 or 4 year research project. And so we do have a lot of flexibility where we thought we wanted to inform this decision-making process, but now the community has decided they're more interested in this concept. And so we're going in that direction. And so ultimately our highest level of performance is informing, right? And the way we think about informing, which is the research project and their partners, the researchers and their partners are able to adequately communicate information into decision-making conversations, and that information is discussed. It doesn't mean that it's decided upon. It doesn't mean that a decision was made necessarily because of it, because a lot of that is decisions are made for lots of reasons that aren't always guided by science, but if the science isn't there, that means something too. And so for us, what we're really looking for is the information making it to the individuals or decision-making bodies, and are they discussing it as part of their deliberations? And then whatever they decide is based on a multitude of factors. It'd be great if it was always science, but for us, we want to make sure if whatever decision they make, if it's sustainable or unsustainable by whoever's view of that, it won't be because they didn't have the information. So we like to say we're not advocates for change, but we're advocates for science, using the science in the discussions. So that's how we think about
Thanks.
evaluation.
Megan? Oh,
Or Molly.
Oh, let's do it.
Go ahead.
Okay. And yeah, so yes, everything that Charlotte said. And I think something we are heavily digging into at the Science Collaborative is, thinking about the fact that collaborative science is really good at achieving a lot of different types of impacts, right? And, the outputs and outcomes are defined by the work. And, that aside, there's also these other things we need to be thoughtful about. Engaged research is really well suited to bring about longer term impacts, like changes in decision making and changes in policy and behavior. And those longer term impacts come from something else, right? What comes before that? There's a lot of near term impacts that are so important and so they happen quite a bit within collaborative and engaged research. Collaborative research is really good at achieving things like capacity building at the individual level and at the team level, relationship buildings and connections, and producing those resources that can be useful in making decisions. And so those near-term impacts are the things we can actually start to capture during a project and at project completion, even though those longer-term impacts of things that we're all striving for, the thing you put in your proposal, the longer-term thing that you really want to happen, but you can't say for sure it will happen. But the things that you do know are going to happen because you're engaging with partners, are those relationships, that capacity changes that are happening. And so we're trying to equip ourselves to and teams to think about those as meaningful and important impacts, and they're essential for getting to those longer term impacts. So valuing those, recognizing we're doing all of these things and they're achieving really important impacts along the way ahead of those behavior changes or changes in decision making.
I think one thing that's a little bit different about us is we don't actually really evaluate individual projects and proposals. I mean, and for one reason I think I saw in the chat is that because we recognize that the outcomes of a project are going to be achieved if they are achieved, long beyond when the final report comes in and the papers are done and all of that stuff. So it's hard to really assess that in a regular funding cycle. And I think we also recognize that, it's rarely one project that changes things. It's a body of work, right? It's the kind of the collective, what science says collectively that leads to changes and outcomes. And so we recognize that as well. We have done some studies where we've looked back at older projects, 10 years old and gone back and said, okay, well, what came of that? Is it being used? So we've looked at planning documents and interviewed people and things of that nature to see kind of what, if it's led to some of that long-term change. And that work has been fruitful. I think it's interesting. It's encouraging to see that, that science has been impactful. It has been utilized. But that work is really labor intensive. So, we can't really do that with all of our projects. One thing that we do take very seriously and put a lot of thought into is how we're evaluating our boundary organizations, our Fire Science Exchange Network, because again, they're that long-term organization that's engaged in science and management, and they, I think, can give us a better perspective of what is the end state of the science and how is it being utilized. So even though I mentioned that we had this long-term commitment to fund them, they do have to reapply every so often. And so they do have to kind of submit proposals, and they have to present annual reports and things of that nature. And so it's a chance for us to kind of evaluate how they're doing. And they do give us widgets, things like the number of products they've put out there, and those are great metrics. But of course, it doesn't really tell you the whole story. We've also, with Allison's help and with her colleague Gigi Owens, we've incorporated some, looking at stories, asking them every year to give us stories of their impact, and again, categorized on some of the things that Allison has put out there. So different categories of societal impact, from short-term things like connecting people and building partnerships to long-term things like changing things on the ground or changing policy and things of that nature. And that to me has been really exciting. Every year they'll come to us with 2 or 3 stories, and some of it is like, oh yeah, we made this new connection with a partner we haven't met before, and that's a great short-term outcome. But again, because they've been in place for so long, we are actually getting some stories of that longer term impact to society and the ecosystems, and that's really exciting to see. So.
One really quick addition to Molly's point that use comes from a larger body of work and generally not from a single project. I think part of what we have to do as well is expand our definition of what success looks like, or what we perceive impact to be. And I'll just give an example that, often when we have a project scientist who's working with a tribal partner for the first time, the first project is really about building trust. And there should be no expectation of use at the end of that project necessarily, but that project will then develop into another project and a third project, and it'll get there. But if you look purely at this use definition, you might consider that project a failure. It's not, it's a building block to this bigger picture.
I'm looking at some of the amazing questions coming in, and you just hit on one perfectly, Aparna, that just acknowledging that, we've been talking about trust and relationship building and how important that is, and funding cycles don't often lend themselves to that. So Aparna, you just gave a great example of awareness on the funder side of the different expectations for new partnerships. And I wonder if any of the other programs have, maybe it's not a standard operating procedure, but just something that you keep in mind, sort of different expectations for what happens early on in a partnership versus later in a partnership, and that trust building aspect. Charlotte.
I would not say I have deep knowledge of this, but one thing we have tried really in the last year was a round of what we call planning grants, which are, and this is not new. There have been many federal funding opportunities that do the exact same thing. So I'm actually in this case learning from you all in that space. But they are short. They're 1 year. And they're, smaller amounts of money, and the budgets are really looking for engagement. So it's money to travel, it's money to convene, it's money to visit different communities and understand their needs. And I think that's I think the challenge is in a traditional grant. No, it's really hard. A lot of times these relationships are already built in order to meet a timeline or a deadline, particularly when the open call is announced 1 month and 3 months later, you've got to send a fully formed idea of how great your trust is and how you're working in community in a way that you weren't previously. I agree. I think it is definitely a challenge that I don't think there is a perfect answer for quite yet. I did like Megan's point of, and I'm trying now to think, because of some of the flexibility we have, how we could build projects that really also are two-step. And I know the federal government sometimes does this in different funding opportunities, where it's a two-step process, where the first is a series of planning grants, and then from those planning grants come an opportunity to apply for a fully fledged grant based on what that planning activity came up with. I think that might be a model which we could try in the future.
I have another great question in here, and then I have a request for all of our panelists. But I really like this because we're getting close to the end of time. I think this is a great one to go out on. If you had to give advice to a PI who's writing a transdisciplinary engaged research proposal, maybe needing to make the case to a panel that is not as familiar as your programs are with this kind of research, what would you suggest? What the phrasing was, how do you impress the panel on the value of this kind of research with different expected outcomes than a typical research proposal? Do you have what advice would you give somebody? I think this is a great question.
Yeah, jump in kind of back to this outcome, near and long-term outcome idea that I was talking about earlier, that I've heard panel upon panel talking about this, where they say, an applicant is describing, we're going to produce these outputs and they're going to get used. And they just want to be convinced that it's going to work and that it's going to happen. And so if you're talking about engaging with partners and you're talking about being in conversation with them about the design of the research, the shaping of the research, and, field sites and things like that, getting their input on that and getting their support and influence on the work, building connections, developing relationships and trust, so that towards the end of the project, you have people who are invested in the science who are also able to use that science and make decisions. So I think you can help reviewers understand more specifically how the work will have an impact if you are involving those in it who will be using it, right? And so it helps them see the stepwise nature of it and articulating impacts along the way, like those that I just named, relationships and trust. Because no one's going to use it if they don't trust the science, where it came from, and it doesn't answer their questions. So it's really foundational to use, and just making that clear that you know that, and you're not just engaging for the heck of engaging. You're doing it with a purpose.
I'd also say we
Oh,
find
go ahead.
letters of support really, really great. I mean, we actually don't require them, but sometimes they're, I think the star of a proposal, if you can get a letter from a practitioner that you're working with that really says, yeah, this is what we need. And it's not a canned letter that you wrote yourself and had someone go and sign. But if it's something that is coming from them, that goes a long way.
Great. Aparna, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add that as a program officer, you want the best proposals that you're going to get. So I hope that we on this call have seemed approachable in general. If you're interested in applying for funding, I do recommend you reach out to the program officer and talk to them, because I agree that people should be making the case that this kind of research is valuable, but there are pots of money where this is just not going to be funded. And so having that straight conversation with the program officer to say, hey, these are the things I want to do. Does it fit with the mission and the objectives of your program, the goals for what you're trying to accomplish with this funding? Are there ways that I could better align, or messages that I could highlight and that will resonate with your community of reviewers? And the program officer, like I said, they want to get the best possible proposals. So they can't help you write the proposal, they can't come up with the details, but they can generally give you advice on how to best align your ideas with the call.
Great, thanks. I have one request that I did not make any of you ahead of time, but and sort of following up on that question, if you have like key resources, maybe it's something from your program that you do send out as guidance or something that you rely on, maybe that's something that we can share with everybody. If it's easy to link to in the chat, we can do that. And if not, Jessica and Pamela can probably help us send it out when we do the recording and stuff. But it just is occurring to me that, you know, I know some of the resources each one of you do, but if you've got your favorites or something that you find really valuable, I think that would be fantastic to be able to share with everybody.
Yeah, and it looks like the chat is not actually letting us chat with all of the participants. So email me those and then I will send it out. So those of you putting it in the chat now, it's just going to the hosts and panelists. So we'll go ahead, email me. I will send it out in a follow-up email for all of the registrants. So we have to wrap up now. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. They were so fantastic, though, and people are really thinking deeply about this. Thank you, Allison, and all of the fantastic speakers for sharing your insights and experiences today. Personally, I found the information really helpful. I'm sure many of our attendees feel the same way. You've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate the time and effort that you put into these discussions. And thanks to Pamela, Jessica A., Rodney, Katie, our captioner, our 2 ASL interpreters for helping make this webinar possible. I encourage folks to stick around for our poll. Pamela, you can go ahead and launch that. Just gives us an idea of whether you think this is helpful, etc. So thanks to everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all so much. This was great. And thanks for all of the excellent questions, everybody.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.